I'm sure you're looking forward to this exciting time that we'll share together as we engage what justice looks like. A biblical understanding of justice emphasizes righteousness, mercy, and fairness as attributes of God's character and calls for human actions to reflect those values within community. Justice in the biblical understanding goes beyond legal definitions, and it is deeply relational and oftentimes synonymous with righteousness, right standing, right relationship, right doing, and is rooted in God's covenantal relationship with humanity. Justice in the context of the environment, crime, slavery, and racism has many dimensions, encompassing equity, accountability, and includes addressing historical and ongoing harms. In relation to the environment, especially in small island states, justice begs us to consider how climate change disproportionately impacts us, to determine what actions might look like in the context of international environmental policies, and to figure out how local communities must balance economic development with environmental sustainability. As we consider slavery in the Caribbean, we must reflect on what justice looks like for the descendants of enslaved peoples and how the concept of justice is in the context of slavery intersects with modern discussions on race, inequality, economic realities, trafficking of people, and all forms of modern-day slavery. In speaking of crime in the Caribbean, our conversations must delve into how the legacy of colonialism and economic inequality contribute to the high rates of violent crimes in parts of the Caribbean, while considering the role of restorative justice and how Caribbean nations must balance crime control with the protection of human rights, especially in marginalized communities. And as we speak about racism in the Americas, we must address systemic racism in our societies, particularly in terms of economic inequality, access to healthcare and education. And we must venture to speak about the policy changes that are needed to address the deep-rooted history of racial injustice, from slavery to the contemporary racial discriminations. So, sisters and brothers, the members of the panel who are here this afternoon are uniquely qualified to open up these conversations and to offer us some perspectives that will help us to consider the pertinent issues that might emerge from that discussion. They will reflect on the theme for our session, what does justice look like, from their own unique vantage points. Ms. Gina Ebanks-Petrie is the Director of the Department of Environment with the Cayman Islands and will speak about the environment of small island states with particular reference to the Cayman Islands. Professor Dr. Livingston Smith is the Provost and Vice President of the University College of the Cayman Islands, and he will tackle the justice issues that arise from slavery in the Caribbean with some attention to the historical nuances of slavery in the Cayman Islands. The Right Reverend Gary Harriott, CD, is the moderator of the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. His long-standing, intentional, and ecumenical work on the many social challenges in Jamaica and the region will prove as a good basis for his input on crime in the Caribbean, but particularly in Jamaica. And the Reverend Bernard Nitti is a minister with the Presbyterian Church USA and a pastor of the Westmount Presbyterian Church in Western Pennsylvania. His personal, academic, professional, and pastoral experiences uniquely qualify him to raise some concerns around the issue of racism. The panelists have agreed to make presentations first, raising the issues and perhaps even offering some things for the church to consider. And then we will have a brief time to discuss among them any of the connections that we can make in the conversations that they'll raise and offer some clarifications. And then, of course, open the floor for the questions that you will have, that you will pose to them. So please put your hands together as we welcome our panelists this afternoon. I invite Ms. Gina to come and share with us first.
Thanks very much, Reverend Myers. Good afternoon, everyone. I have to say that I think this is a first for me, speaking on environmental issues to the church, a group of faith-based people. But I would just like to start off by commending your organization for highlighting the issue of environmental justice in your deliberations during your time together here in Cayman, and to thank Angela for inviting me to be a part of this panel in order to share my perspectives on this topic. So, as best we know, humanity has been gifted one planet in God's universe, which supports life as we know it. And yet, as we sit here today, this one home we have, planet Earth, is in crisis. Our limited time we have together, it isn't possible for me to present the evidence behind that statement. Instead, I have proceeded in faith that we are all able to accept that during our time on Earth, humans and our activities have so fundamentally altered our planet's life-supporting systems that several global tipping points are fast approaching, with potentially catastrophic consequences for humanity and the planet if current trends continue. This week, as the countries of the world meet in Cali, Colombia for the 16th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Worldwide Fund for Nature's 2024 Living Planet report has declared that the next 5 years are critical for the future of life on Earth. The WWF Living Planet report highlights a global crisis, revealing a catastrophic decline of 73% in wildlife populations over the last 50 years, as measured by their Living Planet Index. The declines have been particularly calamitous in Latin America and the Caribbean, which have seen a 94% drop in the average wildlife population size. Declines in population sizes serve as early warning signs of rising extinction rates and the potential collapse of important ecosystems. The situation is now so dire that scientists have declared two separate but interdependent and tightly coupled crises, namely climate change and biodiversity loss. And so as not to lose anyone in the jargon, biodiversity simply means a term that describes the variety of life on Earth. In the ocean, rising temperatures increase the risk of irreversible loss of marine and coastal ecosystems. Live coral reefs, for example, have nearly halved in the last 150 years, and further warming threatens to destroy almost all remaining reefs. In Cayman, despite nearly 4 decades of marine protected areas, supported by other sound management interventions, our coral reefs have not been immune. We have seen our reefs decline from 40% live coral cover in 1997 on Grand Cayman to just 6% in the DOE's most recent survey conducted last year. This is why it is so critical that we avoid decisions now and in the future that further stress our ailing reef ecosystems. They will simply be unable to cope. To reach the Global Biodiversity Framework's target in Montreal, 2 years of safeguarding agreed 2 years ago in Montreal, of safeguarding 30% of the planet's land, water, and seas by 2030, a substantial expansion of effective protected areas is crucial. Presently, only 16% of land and 8% of our oceans are protected globally, highlighting the urgency of the task ahead. In Cayman to date, we have only managed to protect about 11% of our native habitats on land across the 3 islands. Our nearshore coastal shelf now enjoys upwards of 40% protection within no-take marine reserves, so the news is better for us in our oceans. Ahead of the 29th Conference of the Parties for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which begins on the 11th of November in Azerbaijan, the UN has in the last week issued yet another stark warning on climate change. The UN report says that the goals of the Paris Agreement to keep global temperatures under 2 degrees C while making efforts to stay below 1.5 degrees C are now in very serious danger of not being realized. Again, I don't have the time to explain why this is important, but I would like to stress that keeping warming below 1.5 degrees C is extremely important to avoid the most disastrous impacts of climate change, and it is vital to the very survival of small islands like Cayman and many countries in this region. The UN emissions gap report indicates that if only current policies are implemented, the world could warm upwards by 3.1 degrees C. So we're trying to stay at 1.5, hopefully going to keep it under 2, but if we only do what we said we're going to do, we're going to warm by 3.1 degrees C. It goes on to say, this would be catastrophic for the world, according to the UN, leading to dramatic increases in extreme weather events, including heat waves and floods. Working outside, for example, under that level of warming would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. And let us not think that these are the only impacts we're seeing and will likely see from predicted climate change. Overall, climate change affects the health of ecosystems, influencing shifts in the distribution of plants, viruses, animals, and even human settlements. It will affect food security and agricultural systems, rainfall, and the availability of potable water, and will create increased opportunities for animals to spread diseases and for viruses to spill over to humans. Human health will also be affected by reduced ecosystem services, such as the loss of food, medicine, and livelihoods. In a recent editorial, several of the world's leading medical journals, The Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the British Medical Journal, warned that climate change is the greatest threat and risk to public health. They go on to note that no temperature rise is safe. In the past 20 years, heat-related mortality among people over 65 has increased by more than 50%. Climate change, then, will disproportionately affect some of our most vulnerable citizens, the poor, the sick, and the elderly. In the spring of next year, countries will need to submit emissions reduction plans called nationally determined contributions. These plans have been described by the UN Climate Chief as among the most important documents produced this century. So the message is clear. We can no longer delay action, and countries around the globe need to produce concrete plans to curb emissions now. The problem is that the science is unequivocal, and the message has been clear for some time now, but we have still collectively failed to take the necessary action. Now, the reasons behind this are complex and multifaceted, and the subject of many articles and debates, so I won't even try to get into that right now. Instead, what I would like to do is spend the rest of my limited time here on considering the role of churches and other faith-based organizations in helping to cut through what I'm calling the noise surrounding the environmental crises and providing a moral framework and a guiding light for humanity to try to save ourselves. I should say that while I am not fully aware of what positions our local churches have taken on the dual crises facing our planet, or indeed what regional or global organizations such as yours may be doing in this regard, I have read the Accra Confession, and I can see a clear recognition in the text of that document of the Christian imperative that we act as good stewards of our planet and its resources. Examples include, we reject any theology which affirms that human interests dominate nature, and, quote, we confess our sin in misusing creation and failing to play our role as stewards and companions of nature. I also see a very clear call to action at the end of the text. It goes, now we proclaim with passion that we will commit ourselves, our time and our energy to changing, renewing, and restoring the economy and the earth, choosing life so that we and our descendants might live. My question to you, therefore, without any judgment, absolutely, is, do you feel that the church or your organization has made concrete progress in delivering on your commitments in this confession that was agreed over some 20 years ago? And if not, why not? I am not suggesting that any of this is easy. For one, environmental issues have become extremely polarized and polarizing, making it even harder to have the difficult conversations which need to be had in order to move the needle on these difficult issues. Scientists and the environmental community must accept some of the responsibility for this state of affairs. There is also the reality that there are still many persons of faith who take the position that God is in charge and that we should just leave it all in his hands. Although I can understand that concept intellectually, I confess I have some real problems with this perspective. And referring to the text of the Accra Convention, I believe that you too will take issue with that perspective. It is clear, and understanding human psychology helps us to understand, that simply providing people with the facts about the peril of our planet, and therefore all of us face, doesn't work. Trying to guilt people into taking action also doesn't work. If we can acknowledge that the traditional ways of communicating have failed us in developing global consensus on how to fix our planet, it seems to me that there may be a space here for faith and Christian doctrine to help. So again, I ask, do you believe that the church and other faith-based organizations have been deliberate enough in bringing these complex issues to people of faith, providing them with a faith-based frame that allows them to be accountable for their own actions, to hold their governments to account for their failure to act, and to provide them with hope? I am a strong believer that people need hope. It's very clear that our human psychology needs hope. So in closing, I would like to read from a book that I was recently gifted, as the author expresses my views on hope much more eloquently than I could ever hope to do. The book is called Saving Us and is authored by Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, a well-respected climate scientist who has contributed to the regular consensus reports produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She also serves as the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy and is a practicing Christian. In her book, Dr. Hayhoe says, "I often hear this from other Christians. God is in control, they say piously, so shouldn't we just leave it in his hands? Each time I wonder, haven't they read what the Bible says about reaping what you sow? God never promised to rescue us humans from the result of our bad decisions. Quite the opposite. The book of Proverbs warns, whoever sows injustice will reap calamity. And Hosea says, even more to the point, for they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. Consequences are not a punishment for sin, as some televangelists hasten to claim every time a disaster strikes. They're the simple consequence of the fact that we are all subject to the rules of physics. If humans increase heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, the planet warms. Pretending we can defy physics by putting our heads in the sand or cultivating a positive attitude will merely keep us slightly happier until, and more surprised when, the axe falls." She then goes on to speak about complacency and misplaced optimism as other forms of false hope. False hope springs from our defense mechanisms. We employ them to deny and distract ourselves from a problem we feel helpless to face, or bad news we don't want to hear. That's why true hope must begin by recognizing the risk and understanding what's at stake. Rational hope accepts that success is not inevitable or even entirely probable. It takes courage to do that. But when we are doubtful, when the odds are low, and success is possible rather than probable, it's that courage and hope that carry us forward. Because the provenance for hope, the Apostle Paul says, is not where we might think. It's not in rosy circumstances and positive conditions. It doesn't arrive when everything is going our way. In his epistle to the Romans, he lays it out. We know that troubles help us learn not to give up. When we have learned not to give up, it shows we have stood the test. When we have stood the test, it gives us hope. Paul doesn't mention courage, but that runs through the entire verse. It takes courage to persevere under suffering. Courage is part of character, and therefore courage is an essential ingredient of rational, constructive hope. And I love how he ends. Hope never makes us ashamed because the love of God has come into our hearts. Love casts out fear, the Bible tells us, and it casts out shame as well. It's the glue that brings us together when every other force in the world, it seems, is trying to divide us into smaller and smaller tribes. Science tells us it's too late to avoid all of the impacts of climate change. Some are already here today. Others are inevitable because of the past choices we've made, and that can make us afraid. Science also tells us that much of what we do is actively contributing to the problem, from turning on our lights to what we eat for lunch. That makes us feel guilt. But the research I do is clear. It is not too late to avoid the most serious and dangerous impacts. Our choices will determine what happens. The future we collectively face will be forged by our own actions. Climate change stands between us and a breathtaking, exhilarating future. We cannot afford to be paralyzed by fear or shame. We must act with power, love, and a sound mind. Together, we can save ourselves. And that's what I want to leave you with. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I'm entirely happy to be here this evening and to participate in this intriguing program. I was asked to sketch briefly an outline of slavery in the Caribbean while taking into consideration the Cayman Islands, and then to give some structure to the view that justice can be kind of constructed from that in some way. I intend to do that. So I was at church some time ago, and we were studying a scripture, Ephesians 6:5-9, where Paul says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and sincerity, and all those wonderful things. Obey them, not just when they're around you, but when they're not around you, obey them still." And I remember in that session, many persons were kind of conflicted. How come St. Paul didn't mash down slavery? You know what I'm saying? How come he didn't find a way to end it right away? Because that is so evil. And I start with that because sometimes persons make that mistake of equating slavery that occurred in ancient societies with what happened in the Caribbean context, what we call the New World context, the whole matter of the slave trade we had here for nearly 400 years, at least slavery itself. Not that slavery is not bad in the way you find it. Whether it be in ancient Greece or Roman times, it was not a moral thing. But the character of slavery then was quite different from what we had in the New World. For one, for example, in ancient times, slavery was not a racial thing. Race plays no role. Slaves could reasonably expect to be emancipated during their lifetime. Many slaves worked in specialized fields, in very complicated fields. etc., etc. In fact, in the Roman Empire, slaves could be freed and then become a Roman citizen and that kind of thing. However, that is not what happened in the New World. Totally different. What we had in the New World was something called chattel slavery. I'm going to give a definition of that posed by one of the most prominent thinkers on slavery, historical sociologist Orlando Patterson of Harvard. If you read his books, I mean, he's clearly the global leader in that. I mean, for example, the book Slavery and Social Death. The one I liked was his most recent book, which looked at, entitled Freedom in the Making of Western Civilization, in which, Patterson in this book explores how comes the Western part of the world has such a very deep regard for freedom, liberty, those kind of things. And he was able to locate that kind of thing coming out of the slavery experience, but that is for another discussion. So he says that slavery is a personal, violent domination of alienated persons who are dishonored. One person is under the direct power of another or his agent. In practice, it entails the power of life and death over the slave. The slave doesn't belong to the legitimate social or moral community. The slave has no independent social existence. The slave only exists by virtue of his master, things like that. But when one studies slavery in the modern world, it's really one of the worst things you could ever imagine, seriously, all right? Now, let me just spend a few moments talking about the numbers of persons who came from Africa to what was called the New World. The best data we have on that, I think, is the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, put together by a number of researchers. And they, by virtue of their extensive studies, say that about 36,000 slave voyages took place between the 16th and the 19th centuries. 12.5 million Africans were taken forcibly from Africa to the so-called New World, the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade, the whole idea of the triangular trade. Slaves, Europeans left Europe on their ships to West Africa to the New World, and back again. Huge business for many, many years. So just to pause very quickly to look at the size of the area from which slaves came. For example, Senegal and Gambia, modern Sierra Leone on the westward coast, included the modern Ivory Coast of Liberia, the Gold Coast of present-day Ghana, the Bight of Benin, including today's Togo and Benin, Angola and so on, and all of that. So large region, very large region. That's why so many were the trading areas from Africa that African Americans can claim many and different ancestral homelands. Brazilians, Angola, the say came from Angola, African Americans, South Carolina and Angola, Jamaica and the other Caribbean islands. Our closest ties are with Ghana and the Akana Shanti people, Yoruba, Igbo, Ibibiyu of Nigeria. I myself did attest that I'm definitely quite a bit of Nigerian. So it was a huge, huge endeavor. I emphasize that. I emphasize that to make some point later on. Now, slavery in the Cayman Islands, as you know, went on for 100 years. Quite a bit of discussion on the nature of slavery in the Cayman Islands, particularly between two local stalwarts, Dr. Christopher Williams and Mr. Roy Borden, who you'd have known about. And they take different positions, even though recently I think Mr. Borden has come a long way in seeing it differently. The argument is that Cayman had far fewer slaves compared to their neighbors. All right, so Borden takes a more numerical argument, arguing that it was not as pervasive and maybe not as evil. I think both of them agree that, even though in 1774, the population of Cayman was 400 persons, half of that were slaves. By 1802, 933 persons, 58% of that were slaves. They came to emancipation in 1834, 54% of the population were slaves, all right? So the argument was that in the Cayman Islands, small population, half were slaves, half were not slaves. In other islands, a huge difference in terms of the number of slaves compared to the white plantocracy. The fact is, though, that slavery existed in the Cayman Islands and had all the necessary things that go with that, all right? And that's very important to note. I won't spend too much time on that, except to note that some 400 years of hardened racist legacy, you'd expect that to not disappear like that. So we still have vestiges of that in the society today. I would read in a paper by Dr. Christopher Williams, who I think writes very well on these things, and he argues that these legacies are still present in some way. Of course, there are fundamental changes, but you still have these legacies which are in society. Sometimes subtle implicit biases, what you call nestled in our consciousness, or just below in our preconscious and things like that. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to speak now about the impacts of slavery generally, before I talk about what justice might look like in considering the breadth of this institution. I was reading this book by Neil Ferguson. Neil Ferguson is a well-known professor at Harvard. He wrote this book entitled How Britain Made the Modern World. And he argues in this book that Britain invented capitalism, the English language, private property, the rule of law, parliamentary structures, individual freedom and Protestant Christianity, etc., and that on balance, the British Empire was a good thing. He even suggests that colonized peoples, especially those he decides are not doing well, will have benefited from longer, not shorter periods of colonization. Awesome! Can you imagine that? He doesn't mention how the British Empire slighted the humanity of subject peoples and sacrificed them to the insatiable demands of a capitalist accumulation process. He misses the systematic features of imperial exploitation of the colonized and enslaved. He downplays the enormous contribution made by plantation slavery to British economic growth in the 18th and 19th centuries. He misses, totally misses, the systematic features of imperial exploitation of the colonized and so on and so forth. However, if one wants to get a good summary of the expansive nature of the effects of slavery, I recommend to you this book by philosopher Charles Mills entitled The Racial Contract. An excellent book, great summary by this philosopher. My time is going very fast, but essentially what he does in this book is to argue that the social and political structures of modern society are deeply rooted in an implicit racial contract. This contract, unspoken, unwritten, however, it's real. It has historical structured society. It has historically structured society along racial lines, benefiting white people at the expense of people of color. And slavery is a fundamental component of this contract, etc., etc., etc. All right? So in this book, Mills examines slavery not just as an economic system, but a racial one, where non-white peoples historically were seen as sub-persons who could be owned and all of that. And so if you want to get a thorough understanding of the breadth of the impact of slavery, I recommend that book highly. This important philosopher died recently. That was quite a loss, quite a loss. Not to go off track, but philosophy tends to be, not many non-white persons are into philosophy, but he really made his name in philosophy. Okay, good. Now, I'm just like kind of warming up. So by framing slavery within the context of the racial contract, Mills emphasizes that its effects are not simply historical, its effects are foundational and persistent. That's imperative, explaining racial disparities that continue today. His work calls for a recognition of this contract to understand modern racial injustices. They're not coincidental. They are the direct result of systemic and deeply ingrained racial structures originating in slavery and colonialism. When George Floyd died in that horrific incident, I wrote a column for a local paper in which I argued that modern racism has its genesis in a conjunction of circumstances in global history which led to European imperialism. And I went from there to look at the devastating outcome of the Colombian enterprise, the genocide of native Indians, 16th and 17th centuries, enslavement of some 12 million people, etc., etc. And then I spoke about Patterson's work on social death and things like that. But I also drew from, when he died, the Chancellor for UWI, Sir Hilary Beckles, Professor Beckles, himself one of our best historians, he put out something, and I quoted from it. And just to give you just a paragraph from that, while I come now to the justice element of it. He says that from that moment, when the British government in 1636 took the first step to legally classify all blacks in their colonies as non-human chattel, property, and real estate, and proceeded with their European partners to build and manage it with a global business model for 400 years, the greatest financial juggernaut of world history, humanity was poisoned with the toxic pandemic of racial hatred. And from the date 1783, when Justice Chief Mansell of England in the Zong trial boldly proclaimed that the blacks in the case before him are no different from so many horses, sheep, and goats, the poison had permeated every community in the Western world. So now, fundamental change has happened. Things have changed in significant ways. We must not, belittle that. That's very important. So even with significant and meaningful change for the better, the globe is still tainted with the negative impacts of the historical enslavement of African people. In the American context, I could go on to look at some examples. The expulsion of racist ideas and behaviors from human societies has been difficult to achieve. Difficult. And I'm going to say, Reverend, that not even the church has managed to expunge it from it. That's a fact. I mean, so one of the recommendations I'm going to make later on is that I wonder if the church could get rid of it as an example to the world, all right? So the expulsion of racist ideas and behaviors from human societies has been difficult to achieve, all right? And I don't want to go, I think my time is gone. In light of what I've said a while ago, are we able to reach the conclusion that Rex Nettleford asked the world to reach when he gave this beautiful speech to the UN in 2007? many of you wouldn't know who that person is, but Professor Rex Nettleford, one of the best persons we have ever produced in the Caribbean. Great intellect, great other things to him. And he was asked to give a speech to the UN in March 26, 2007. That was the 200th anniversary of the end of the transatlantic slave trade. And he ended his speech in this way. Can the world, without anguish, accept itself as part this, part that, part the other, but totally human, without one part of it trying to dominate the other? Now, that I think is a question that we have to look at. As I come down, what should justice look like? Which, of course, is very important, and I'm going to come down very, very shortly. I don't know if any of you were following the meeting in Samoa of the Commonwealth leaders. Anybody following that? Exciting times happened in Samoa. The Caribbean leaders were saying, we want to put reparation on the agenda. And the Prime Minister said, no, you're not. He said, we don't pay reparations. I think the argument for reparations is a just argument. I think that it's a good argument to make. The literature is very clear. The work has been done. We know what happened in detail. We also know we have quantified what it would take to bring justice to what happened for nearly 400 years. The Foreign Minister of Bahamas, Frederick Mitchell, speaking to the BBC, said that reparatory justice for slavery can come in many forms, including financial reparations, debt relief, and official apology, educational programs, building museums, economic support, public health assistance, and so on. All right? Very good discussion that went on. Caribbean governments are pushing it. And there have been growing calls from the Commonwealth leaders for the UK to apologize. And of course, it's not just a UK thing. Other countries in Europe were also involved. But of course, we were more linked to the UK. All right? And how much money are they talking about? Well, go on the website, the reparation website, and you'll see a figure put out there. I'm coming down, Reverend. What is the figure here for you, though? I think it's, I saw T beside it, you know. T would mean trillion, right? I saw T there. It's quite a bit of money, boy. But quite a bit of money. But that is, I think the church, though, should have a voice there. I think it's a moral thing to do. Particularly, once you study slavery, you know that at points, the church was complicit. And that the religion has all kind of parts to it. But the church was complicit to some extent. I think that the work is done. Maybe the church should play a part of that. I want to support the point you made, though, as I come down. The environment is also related to what I've just spoken about. I take the work of Mia Motley very seriously. Mia Motley is just putting it to the army. It's really very good work. In fact, I've written 2 columns on Mia Motley. What a strong lady she is, I tell you. And she speaks about the environment very powerfully, very beautifully. And, but I want to say, though, that climate change, as you were saying, is too important to be left to the scientists. The church and theologians must have a voice. And as the Accra things pointed out, the roots of climate change are also theological, not just technical and scientific and policy related. We're talking about humans, how we imagine God, the creation, the place of humanity within it. All right? All of these things, I don't have time to talk about it. But I want to talk about just mention 2 things that I come down. One is the global order. The global order. And again, Mia Motley was able to talk about that. Don't have time to talk about how the present global system came into being. How it is manifestly unequal, manifestly unjust. And we have had many Caribbean leaders who have spoken about it from different philosophical frameworks. Motley is just the most recent, extremely good speeches he's making. The question is, will it make a difference? But as she said, The problem with the current global order is that it has no real solution to climate degradation and for sustainability. It's motivated by greed and profit, not human dignity and welfare. And she goes on to say, we need a new leadership that is made based on morality. So the solution seemed to be global moral leadership and political will, transforming the financial institutions that came out of World War II and all of that. My time is gone. My last point is that I'm troubled by the fact that I read The Gleaner of Jamaica recently and discovered, Reverend, you following me? Yes, okay, I'm just, I'm just kidding you, right? And found out that they are not training teachers in history again, and social studies again, or RE again. The emphasis is now on STEM. STEM. And there's a concern, I think, about, in fact, a reverend pointed it out. Was it you who pointed that out? There is his person's name here. I thought it resembled you, who pointed it out. Yeah, but a reverend pointed out. His name here is Reverend Darwin Thomas, chairman of the St. Thomas Ministerial Fraternity. All right, so it's not you then. But he was saying that he's very concerned that the lack of historical knowledge could lead to all kinds of problems. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you so much.
Friends, good afternoon, and thanks to our speakers before. So I am here to talk about what justice looks like, crime in the Caribbean with a focus on Jamaica. Now, for many of our Caribbean territories, when others think of us, among the things that come to mind is our breathtaking beaches, our hospitality, our captivating culture, our foods, our music, our athletic prowess, our creativity, our dynamism. But in the midst of that is a real challenge, the challenge of crime, particularly violent crime. Is a major concern for the Caribbean region and Jamaica in particular. Now, CARICOM, and for those who may not know, that is the political instrument that brings together the nations of the region. CARICOM has been very concerned about this matter of crime and violence. And through what is called the Implementation Agency for Crime and Security, has committed to working with member states to disrupt, dismantle, defeat organized crime within its borders, with particular attention given to money laundering and facilitators of crime and corruption. And these things affect the ordinary people in different ways. So, for instance, in Jamaica, it has become a real challenge for anyone to go to the bank to open an account. It requires all kinds of things, references, work letter, and all kinds of things. And there was a time when you could just walk into a bank and say, I'm here to open an account without an issue. So these are some of the ways in which it challenges us. There's a limit, for instance, on how much money you can transfer on a given day. And recently, some banks have actually made it more difficult. If you want to transfer funds over a certain amount of money, you have to make special arrangement with the bank to do so. Corruption has been identified as a significant threat to the Caribbean region. And CARICOM has noted that while the impact is not always tangible, so that's about corruption, it goes beyond financial losses to create the environment of distrust, hindrance to development, undermining of our democratic institutions, our justice systems, and law enforcement. So corruption is not just about money. It affects so many other areas of the lives of our societies. Crime in the Caribbean region, and there are various ones, but these are among those that they have listed: maritime piracy, arms, drug and human trafficking, money laundering, cybercrime, identity theft, extortion, and corruption. I want to talk a little bit about the gravity of the challenge that we face. Now, the United Nations considers any homicide rate of 10 per 100,000 or above to be an epidemic. So 10 per 100,000 or more considered to be an epidemic. Now, the rates of violence make the Caribbean one of the most dangerous parts of the Americas. And based on the UN population estimate in 2022, and the other Caribbean countries that are really challenged, but I've lifted up these 5 highest rates as they have quoted. So Bahamas, 32.0 per 100,000. Trinidad and Tobago, 39.4 per 100,000. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 40.3 per 100,000. St. Lucia, 42.3 per 100,000. So they look at your population size and look at your murder rate and provide these ratios. Jamaica, 52.9 per 100,000. In fact, some of us were in a presentation recently by a Professor Anthony Clayton, who said, actually, when you look at our rates, we are worse than countries that are at war. In the Jamaican context, approximately 1,300 persons are murdered yearly. And we're a population of about 3.5 million. So you put that within that context. And children and women are often victims. And we're seeing some trends, and I'll say a little bit more of that later on, that make so many people vulnerable. And it is interesting that you could actually, as many of us do, you live in Jamaica and you never get close to any of these kinds of incidents. Yet, that's a part of the reality of so many of our communities. Causes of crime and violence, root causes have a history which is situated in slavery and our colonial past as well. So I remember the question was asked about reparation, and it has come up at different times. I remember Roger talking about the tentacles. So crime and violence are among the tentacles that we see as a result of slavery and the colonial past. So where resources of the region utilized to drive the industrial age in Europe, UK, which has therefore contributed to the lack of resources in the region in many of our territories for development. Many countries spend a lot of their income to pay debt, and so very little is left for development of their societies and their people. So listed among some of the root causes, low education attainment. And if you look at some thought, these points I have here, where it says, where half of the males in prison did not complete their secondary education, and over 40% are repeated offenders because they cannot adjust to normal life. That's a reflection of our Jamaican situation. Now, part of my engagement, I'm a part of what is called the Violence Prevention Alliance. And one of the appeals that the Alliance makes is to encourage schools to keep children in school. Because the evidence is there that when a child, especially a boy, drops out of school, you actually end up creating resources for gang violence. And that it is in our best interest to make sure that our children are in school, and especially concerned around boys. So, in fact, Professor Clayton made a point to us that a boy who drops out of school is highly likely to become involved in gangs. And in gangs, people feel accepted, they are supported, and they are engaged. Poverty is another of the causes listed. Inequality, the problems in the family, children who are neglected and abused, who are exposed to violence on a consistent basis, and there are those who will help us to appreciate that overexposure and constant exposure to violence actually alters the physiology of the brain and will likely create you or facilitate you continuing this cycle of violence. I was making the point to some friends at table earlier on that a part of the challenge we find is that we have a number of single parent households, mostly headed by women. But it has actually been proven that those, oftentimes, many of those children have experienced abuse from their mothers, just out of the sheer stress of managing a household. And so we often say that those who have been abused often becomes the perpetuators of abuse. They abuse others. So children who are neglected and abused, and they continue the cycle of violence. The lack of welfare services. I was in the UK recently, and I have family members who are part of the social system, and I found it so interesting. And as I listened to some of the challenges and the expenditure, and I was learning in a particular setting that about $2 million, £2 million per year is spent on this facility to help to redirect youngsters. And the facility has 2 children and a number of layoff staff members. And then I think about what the little we have to take care of children in a children's home, many children, and that our budget is nowhere close to those kinds of figures. Landlessness, and I remember, I think it's Roderick I heard make mention of that, is a real concern, and for us in Jamaica, it's one of the big issues, where people who do not have right to land end up in informal settlement, what we call squatting, poor housing, and that in many cases become the kind of breeding ground for crime, violence, etc. And then there's a drug trade, and there are things associated with that. I think Trinidad has had its own experience of kidnapping connecting to that. We have had robberies, firearm activities, and violence associated with turf wars with rival gangs. And a number of the Caribbean countries are dealing with the issue of gangs. In fact, you'll hear some schools talking about the challenge of gangs in school. Primary school, high school, secondary school. And so that by time, sometimes what you have happening is that the gangs in community have a manifestation in schools, or school become a junior gang setting. And so they continue to fuel that problem of gangs. Firearm is a big problem for us in the region. And the truth is that we do not make guns. Yet, we have lost so many of our people at the hands or as a result of illegal firearms. So firearms and ammunition trafficking are serious concerns for us. There's what is called transnational criminal networks. So the criminals, those who are involved in crime, many of them are well organized and connected, wealthy, resourceful, and so they fund violence in our communities. In fact, some of the murders that we experience in our territories are actually orchestrated from places from which you have come, right? And facilitated in those spaces. And somebody said earlier on, I'm not sure who, what was the term again? Who sold the land, but we know who would pay the price. And so that's a real challenge for us in the region. One that is a fairly, not so new, but it is what is on the lips of so many of us in the region, and in Jamaica we have quite a bit of that, is a problem of scamming. And that has all kinds of manifestations. But interestingly, some of those who are involved in scamming, they justify it as their way of reparation. So they say, well, we're just getting back what you took from us. And it says that the revenue from lottery scam is estimated at US $250 million per year. Now, a part of the social challenge of that now is when many of us went to school, you were told to get an education, and that will provide the upward mobility for you. Many youngsters today are experiencing that upward mobility in terms of material things, dropped out of school, but they are able to drive the high-end motor vehicles. They own things. Youngsters who dropped out of school never worked, but with their creativity can maybe speak with the accents from where you have come in such professional way, and they have never been there. So they are able to, they're creative, and they're able to persuade, so they have some gifts and abilities, regrettably not used in the most helpful way. But scamming is a big challenge for us, and it is very enticing. So we have had situations where you talk with children in primary school to have a sense of what they want to become. And some of them tell you they want to become scammers. Or the new term is chopper. They want to become a chopper because they look and they see all of this material wealth that some of these persons are able to parade, and they want that. Connected to that, we have the inter-gang violence, intra-gang violence, because sometimes the spoils are not shared as they should. And so it creates conflict within. And so it becomes bloody. And what makes that really very challenging for us, and we have seen a few incidents in Jamaica in recent time, where somebody, an innocent family, could become victim because somebody connected to your family is connected to the system or the problem. And in Jamaica, we say, if you can't catch Kwaku, you catch him short. Meaning, if I can't get to you who has cheated me, I will get to somebody close to you. I'll get to your family, your parents, your children. And in fact, in Jamaica, just over the past few weeks, we've had a few of the incidents where people are at a party and somebody drives up, or some people drive up in a motor vehicle, open fire, and then you have 5, 4, 7 people killed, others who have been hurt and hospitalized. So that's a part of the challenge you have. And as I said, that it's interesting because you could live in Jamaica, and I'm sure in other Caribbean countries, and you never had anything like this close to you happen right beside you. But it happens. In Jamaica, in Manchester, for instance, where I live, which was considered to be one of the safest communities or areas of Jamaica. That's where people who have lived in the US and UK and Canada who have come home to retire, and that's where they set up their home. The climate is nice and so forth. We have been now concerned about what's happening there because we are seeing some of this manifestation. And these young men, in particular, some of them have become so cold, uncaring, that no matter where you are and they want you, they'll come and get you there. And so we have had situations where children in schools have been just traumatized because of where a shooting took place right at their gate or so. So the impact of crime and violence says the average life expectancy of active gang members. The average life expectancy of active gang members is below 25 years old. So in some of the communities, some of the guys, if they live to be 30, are considered old. Yet, crime and violence remains very attractive, and the wealth that comes with it. Violence affects not only the victims, but may also result in other sources of income for the countries, tourism. There's a brain drain because some people are afraid. There's a reluctance to invest by foreign investors. There's a general feeling of disquiet and fear among some persons. It is said that in 2017, crime and violence was estimated to be a total cost to Jamaica of 7% of GDP. And that does not include the indirect cost. One of the things that we have seen in Jamaica, and I suspect that other of our Caribbean territories would have had that experience, is that, for instance, sometimes people who are enlisted for surgeries, you may be waiting for months for a surgery to be done. And on the day when your surgery is to be done, it has to be postponed because of persons who have suffered violent attacks, whether motor vehicle crash or gunshots, have to be given priority treatment. So it's a real challenge. In fact, I'm a part of a committee in Jamaica where we're looking at the cost of violence to the society, looking at road traffic as crashes as well, and the impact on the economy. So there are some other implications or impacts. The increased risk of asthma, hypertension, cancer, stroke, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of crime and violence. negative mental health outcomes. And you can think about things like absenteeism, persons who can't go to work because there's a flare-up in their communities, the lack of productivity as a result, the cost to the criminal justice system, etc. So there are other ways in which crime and violence affects us in terms of cost and impact. Way forward. Now, among the challenges highlighted by leaders in the region to address the complex problem of corruption and illicit finance is the shortfalls in institutional capacity. So our limitation in our institutional capacity to handle the challenge. Limited financial and human resources, and the need to strengthen legislation and the criminal justice system. Now, the executive director for the CARICOM program that I mentioned before also talked about the need for political determination, sustained momentum, and substantial investment of resources to deal with the problem. And there are those who have been saying to us, to our countries, that we need to take a more public health approach in addressing crime and violence. And this approach should, they say, should complement the traditional law enforcement approach. But it has been noted that governments of the region tend to employ more punitive approaches to dealing with crime and violence, an approach that is often politicized, as they do not want to appear to be soft on crime. And sometimes the populace pressure the government. What are you doing about crime and violence? But it is argued that the public health approach invites the region to see crime and violence as a disease. And therefore, it's about how do you prevent the disease from spreading. The Violence Prevention Alliance, on which I sit, our leader is also a medical doctor, and she has been arguing that we need to take an approach to dealing with crime and violence as if it is a disease. We must address root causes, investigate, continue to understand the causes, look at consequences of violence, and how to prevent violence from occurring through primary and secondary prevention programs, policy, interventions, and advocacy. And they have talked about the need to empower and engage young people as positive content developers to offset the negative impact of social media and to engage the creativity industries to re-engineer culturally acceptable norms. That we need to promote public awareness and education campaigns in our communities that challenge harmful beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors that contribute to crime and violence. That we should work with all sectors and institutions to improve equitable access to services and options for rehabilitation and reintegration into society, psychosocial support and parental education, addressing domestic violence and integrating mental issues to treat crime and violence. They say that we need to develop and implement target programs and strategies to address young, vulnerable youth at risk at becoming perpetrators of and victims of crime. And then I want to close by making some points about the role of the church. In that recent conversation that we had with Professor Anthony Clayton, he actually appealed to us, some of us as church leaders, that he believes that the church is the right institution to step into this vacuum and to provide leadership. He basically argues that, listen, our politicians are not trusted by the people. And while the church is not perfect, that the church enjoyed the greatest level of moral authority to lead the process. He argues that the church can't do it alone, that the church may not have all the resources to be able to do it, but believe that the church is the best institution in the Jamaican context to lead this charge against crime and violence. He argues that we, well, and others too, that we should help facilitate healing from trauma, especially among our children and youth, and many of our children and young people have been exposed to the trauma of violence. That we should intentionally share in the values formation of our people, where violence tends to be glorified by some. Advocacy, that we should advocate for improved conditions under which people live and exist. We should advocate for better educational opportunities for all our people. And in closing, intentionally help people to deal with conflicts in more healthy and helpful ways. In fact, in Jamaica, the Ministry of Justice has entered a partnership with a number of churches to help with training, etc., so that churches can become more involved in restorative justice, helping people at the community level how to work through their issues so that a disagreement does not have to become violent. One of the areas of concern is among families. And in fact, the police told us some time ago that a number of the concerns or issues that they have noticed is that a number of the conflicts within families are over what we call dead left. Meaning, when you die, what happens to your property? And so family members are in conflict about how your estate should go. And so churches can help to step into that space and to help families and communities to work through their issues. Thank you.
Good evening. I want to say a big thank you to my distinguished panelists who have spoken ahead of me, and thanks for your wisdom and knowledge that you've shared this evening. My name is Reverend Bernard Inti, and I want to say thank you also for your patience. I know we've been here for quite a long time, and most of us are tired, but then you've been very patient, and I hope you all will continue to be patient and give me and give me the gift of your humble ears and your heart to listen to this topic. What does justice look like in the context of racism? What does justice look like in the context of racism? I'd like to mention that this is actually my first public speaking on racism, even though we talk, we, referring to my wife and my son, we talk around the dining table a lot about racism. Given the fact that I am in a unique context, in my 6 years of ministering in the United States, I've served all white churches. My first 3 years, I served in rural America, and in a town of 1,500 population, we were the only black family in that town. And currently, I do serve as a minister of almost about 400-member church capacity, and I have experienced how promoting inclusion, it's something that even the church resists. So I speak not to fan the flame of racism, but to also provide you with a sense of hope that we can realize a beautiful garden here on earth. Because before I came to the United States, I worked in a German bank, and we had German staff, and we all lived as one family. I moved on to work in a Malaysian bank. The boss was from India. We all lived in a beautiful family. So my question is, why is it different in the Caribbean and also in the Americas overall? Indeed, racism is a question of the heart. And I'd like to quote from Amos chapter 5, which says, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. There are those who turn justice into bitterness and cast righteousness to the ground. There are those who hate the one who upholds justice in court and detest the one who tells the truth. There are those who oppress the innocent and take bribes and deprive the poor of justice in the courts. Hear now the call to the church. But let justice roll on like a river and righteousness like a never-failing stream. Some important notes. Racism is measured not by intent, but by its impact on those who are oppressed. Racism can be overt or covert, individual or systemic, intentional or unintentional. Racism grants privilege to some and sustains the dominant group. Racism exists throughout society, including all institutions and even the church. You may be wondering what exactly is racism, because these days words can be defined in so many ways, right? So I'd like to give some perspective about racism in the context in which we are talking. Racism is the combination of social power and racial prejudice forming systems that treat people differently based on their racial group. Privileges are extended to some, while others are dehumanized, excluded, or oppressed. And this leads us to talk about structural racism. Structural racism normalizes racism within institutions and systems, leading to persistent inequality. This inequality affects access to resources such as money, land, housing, education, health, information, and social power. Because inequality is embedded in everyday structures and institutions, it often goes unquestioned and unchallenged by most of society or the dominant culture. Or some may say they become immune to the deeds of racism. In the United States, and I believe in the Caribbean, the structural racism particularly benefits certain groups, fostering division, hate, rejection, and discrimination. In today's society, racism, much like slavery, adapts or mutates, as we learned during these past days, and yet remains visible, but then also hidden in our healthcare systems, in our economy, in politics, in schools, and also in our church. You may be wondering, what does racism look like? And I'd like to use a story to illustrate this. Several years ago, a car carrying members of a black college basketball team was involved in a serious accident on the Southern Highway, leaving 3 young men critically injured. An ambulance was summoned immediately. However, upon arrival, the white driver declared without apology that his policy forbade him from serving black passengers and drove off, leaving the injured behind. Now, thankfully, a compassionate motorist stopped and transported the young man to the nearest hospital. Yet, upon arrival, the attending physician bluntly refused to admit them, stating, "We don't accept blacks in this hospital." Desperately, they were transported to another hospital that admitted black patients, located about 50 miles from the accident scene. Tragically, by the time they arrived, one of the men had died, and the other 2 succumbed shortly after, likely due to the delayed care that could have saved them. Now, this tragic incident exemplifies the devastating effects of a worldview centered on race or tribe or even nationality. And I must confess, not until I came to United States, I didn't know I was black. All along, we described our complexion as chocolate in complexion when writing letters, until I got to United States, where the society was based on the classism of skin color. Now, such systemic racism and inhumane treatment were once common in the American South, and I believe in the Caribbean as well. Sadly, subtle forms of discrimination and racism persist even today. Failure to see others as fellow humans leads to discrimination, hatred, and even violence. Are we truly each other's keepers? Are we each other's neighbor? Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." In 2004, the World Reformed Council of Churches identified and rejected systems that perpetuate racism and injustice, leading to the Accra Confession, for which we are celebrating the Accra Confession 20+. This confession acknowledges such injustices and reminds the church of our role in mending distorted human relationships and restoring life-giving hope. Reverend Dr. Colin Cowan has said, "There is nothing more destructive to human dignity than the curse of injustice." He challenges the church to actively engage in Christ's mission to topple the empire of greed, oppression, and exclusivity, and to pursue life in fullness, the life for which Christ lived and died. And you read John chapter 10, verse 10, it says, "The devil or the enemy cometh not but for to steal and kill and destroy. But I have come to give life, and life in abundance." This life is available to us only if we have the willpower to apply and implement it in our homes, in our churches, and in our country or nation. Friends, racism cultivates the ground for injustice and sin, disrupting the harmony of heaven and earth. If we are truly obedient to God, all elements would align, resulting in harmony throughout creation. In the PCUSA, as the denomination pursues justice, there were three critical focuses that emerged, and this morning, my colleague, Ms. Diane Wright, did mention it, and I'd like to repeat them. The first one was building congregational vitality, which is to challenge ourselves and one another to deepen our faith and joyfully engage with our community and the world. We have to learn to listen to each other's stories. We have to learn to be curious, to find out what exactly is going on in our friends who sit in our pews, in churches, our neighbors, in our communities. What exactly is making them thick or thin, their struggles. That helps us to connect, to understand them, and for us to be their good neighbor. The second point that the PCUSA came up with is dismantling structural racism, which is based on Matthew chapter 25, and which is by advocating and acting to dismantle systems, practices, and beliefs that perpetuate discrimination, bias, and oppression. Racism is taught. And if racism is taught, then it takes education to unlearn it. And it takes the same education to learn how to love one another. There's one thing that I keep telling my church kiddos, those that are young, that when they go to school, they train their mind, but when they come to church, we train their hearts. And that is why we as parents would have to send our children to church so that their hearts are trained to know how to be kind and to love those who do not look like themselves. Unfortunately, these days you go to church and there are very few children in our congregation. What legacy are we going to be leaving our children? What does justice look like? Number one, acknowledgement and reconciliation. Justice requires an honest acknowledgement of past and present racial injustices, followed by steps toward reconciliation. This may include community dialogues, formal apologies, reparations, or other restorative actions that seek to mend relationships harmed by racism. Number two, what does justice look like? Protection of rights. Justice ensures the protection of civil rights where racial discrimination is not only discouraged but also legally prohibited and strictly penalized. This means strengthening laws and policies that prevent racial bias, whether in hiring practices, access to public services, or treatment within the justice system. And lo and behold, oftentimes, whenever God wants to test us, he will use a moment. And this afternoon, before I came here, there was an incident that happened during lunchtime, which was an aha moment. You know, I was invited to sit at a table, and I was directed to pick a chair from another table and come over and sit at this table that I was invited. Now, the chair was empty at the moment, and when I picked it, lo and behold, I had a member of that other table tell me, oh, it is for one of the members who, I may mention his name, her name is Barb. Now, I was pleased and glad that someone spoke up and said, oh, Barb is sitting there. Can you imagine if that person was silent and never spoke a word? And that is what oftentimes happens, that when we see our fellow human beings being maltreated, discriminated, rejected, oppressed, we are quiet and silent. And you wonder why, as Christians. If Jesus bequeathed the church to us to be quiet, like we are today, I don't think the church would have come to this point in our age and in our time. The apostles spoke up in the face of death. They spoke up in the face of being killed. Why are we quiet and silent? Number three, what does justice look like? Justice looks like representation and inclusion. For justice to be real, people of diverse racial backgrounds need to be represented fairly in positions of influence, whether in government, corporate leadership, media, or other areas where decisions are made and cultural narratives are shaped. Inclusion means empowering voices and perspectives from all racial backgrounds, creating a richer, fairer, and more inclusive society. Can you imagine if we were all one color, seated here? We wouldn't be a mosaic people like we are today. You see how beautiful we are of different shades and colors. that is the intention of God for putting us in this beautiful world. What does justice look like? Point number 4, community solidarity and support. Justice involves fostering an environment where communities actively support one another and work to protect each other's rights. This means addressing subtle, everyday racism as well as overt discrimination and supporting policies that promote equality, understanding, and mutual respect. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, Paul wrote, he says that in Christ there is no male or female, there is no Jew or Gentile, there is no slave or free. In Christ, we are all one. There is no north or south or east or west. In Christ, we are all one. And that is what we all have to live by, to see the humanity in others, even though they may look differently from us. And finally, education and awareness is also a point that justice could look like. Education and awareness initiatives can help dismantle misconceptions, reduce biases, and encourage empathy and understanding across racial lines. To cap everything up with the last point, education and awareness. My son educated me in a very profound way just before I came here. You know, he plays soccer. In fact, tomorrow he's playing a championship for his district. Even though he's a freshman, he plays for varsity. And he came to me and asked me, Daddy, how do you overcome your enemy? Well, I sometimes coach him. I am also a soccer coach. So I was thinking he was asking me the question in terms of soccer. So I said, it is about finding out your opponent's weaknesses. He said, no, Daddy, you failed this one. You got an F. And I asked him, so what is the answer? What he said was that it is making your enemy your friend. Friends, if we will learn to make each other a friend, I think our world will be a beautiful garden. Thank you so much.
We have a few minutes that will allow us a chance to have some conversation, but I think it might be a wise thing to just do a stand and sit. What do you think? Stand where you are, a stretch maybe as far as you can reach the sky, and no, not a bathroom break. Or else I'll lose you forever. Then sit again. Thank you so much. I join the panelists in thanking you for being so attentive and listening and participating in that way. And I'm certainly you'd want me on your behalf to thank the panelists for the significant issues that have been raised and how it will inform us. So I'm going to invite you now to share. And I thank you, Dr. Roderick, for coming to the microphone first.
Right. I want to say thanks to the group for all the different contributions. I want to raise one particular issue, and it's open to anyone. In particular, though, I listened to Gary's point, but it's open to anyone. It's an intersection of crime and violence, and issues about racism. I'm of the view that even if we were to learn how to love each other well, treat each other nice, and so on, we're still going to have those problems. The issue of crime and violence, it's much deeper. As you mentioned, Gary, we don't make guns. But in a lot of the nations of the global south, guns are rampant. I would like to submit, and that's where the response comes, that the issues of crime and violence linked with issues of global power are systemic, that they are rooted, for example, the issue of marijuana in the global south. It's not to do with black men alone wanting to, that their love of marijuana and the ways in which they are being sanctioned. The pharmaceutical world, they allow tobacco that kill millions, but they sanction marijuana. And you ask why? I submit it's a pharmaceutical power-based systems. Guns, it is to do with the weapons industry, and therefore it finds an outlet primarily in depressed communities. I want to just stop there because I could go on. I'm putting on the table that some of the issues to do with crime and violence in developing societies are rooted in higher systemic areas of power, and therefore a part of our duty as church and the NGOs is how we struggle with those legislative issues, how we hold our government accountable in relation to the global connectivities, because it is at those levels they would rather give us money to build prisons rather than to enable our society to live in peace. A lot of our young men can be released out of prisons tomorrow, if marijuana were decriminalized in many of our societies. But they want their profits from tobacco compared to that of marijuana. Let me shut up, but I just want to point to the issues of systems.
Thanks, George, for raising that. And I know that there are some societies that have advanced their views and attitude towards marijuana. And I remember in Jamaica, at that time I was at Jamaica Council of Churches and had to represent the church's perspective on the development. And one of the things I remember saying is that we should ensure that those who have paid the price, that the Rastafarian community is not left out of this new development. And because they have paid the price. And even now, we are still here in the struggle because those, again, who are powerful, who have resources, if you're not careful, they are left out of the system as well. In terms of the guns, I know, for instance, the Caribbean community have lobbied the US government because for us, most of our weapons, that's where it's come from. And remember those days in the 80s, 90s, I think, when, like Air Jamaica, when there was a little bit of marijuana found on those planes were grounded. You remember? And they have to pay so much money. And then you ask, but how come all of these weapons are able to come on a flight from some place or to a shipping and, but what we have heard, that there's a deeper commitment from the US side to help to mitigate the flow of illegal firearms into the Caribbean region. And so we hope that that cooperation will continue. But yes, we know, and I mean, I've talked with some of my US colleagues as well, and to say, is there a way in which the church community in the US could help in the lobby? And, you know, I've heard some of the efforts that they have made, but also some of the challenge because it's money. Violence puts money in some people's pocket. And so it is not in some people's interest to solve the problem because it is about economy. But thanks for those thoughts.
If I could just chip in here, thank you so much. I've listened to Prof, and those points are good points, but I want to come back to something not necessarily totally in agreement with what you're saying, is that, and I listened to all the points you made, and I'm a sociologist, but I do at school, right, political scientist. But you take Barbados, you're not doing too bad. Not doing too bad. I mean, Barbados is also colonized, right? And all of that. And I think all of those factors are important, but I think sometimes we underestimate what we have also done ourselves. I think, for example, in the Jamaican scenario, and believe me, all the guys talk about, I know them, I've studied with them too. If there's political will, all right, if the government were to lock down on certain well-known constituencies, go back and read all the different, I mean, read Carlstone paper and all those guys, he taught me in school too. I think that those are important, but there are things the government can do. I think that we have to do what we can do also. I mean, not to belabor the point, I mean, Patterson just wrote a book on called The Confounded Island, Jamaica, and compared it to Barbados, and saw some fundamental differences in the way it developed. But the point I want to make, though, is that those are important. The guns are not created by us. America has plenty of guns right there, too. We have a level of crime in America because they solve the problem. Crime, the rate of solving problems is higher. Anthony Harriot, one of the best persons who studied these things, you know, and so on. I mean, and so on. So anyway, the point I'm making, though, is that we can look at those things that are important, but there are things that each country can do themselves. All right, we can work through the politics, make it less violent. Many of the persons who work there know exactly where the people are. All right, so those are things we can do. Levels of corruption, we can tame that if we really want to, and in doing so, we don't have to always blame the other guys somewhere. That's not what I'm making here, all right?
Thank you very much. Karen Kalawan, Presbyterian Church of Trinidad and Tobago. And in the statistics given by our brother Gary, Trinidad is also listed as one of those countries with a high level of criminality. And I was going to raise something very similar, because in the Trinidadian context, there has been quite a lot done to try to mitigate gun movement into Trinidad, because our gun movement comes from the Latin American base, because we get it from Venezuela. We get it from the South American coast. And in that instance, we are actually one of the gun trafficking zones in the Caribbean. So we don't have to hide that, because we can't deny, you're saying it's coming from the US, but it's coming through Trinidad. And we have to see that there's a connected reality within our islands. We're not just connected through CARICOM and the pull of CARICOM and certain situational realities. We are connected in the criminality as well. My sub-question with regard to that is in relation to music and I'm a musician. I'm someone who, some of you all know that. Trinidad and Tobago has noticed that gunman music has been very popular, and in the space of our musicality, it has led and connected to gang-related incidents. The musicality of that dynamic, which is different, also has an influence in the cultural expression of gangs. And I think we have to understand that cultural reality. It's very unique, and it flows in every island. And that musicality comes from a particular place. And I'm going to digress a little bit and mention that because a lot of the funding of our society is pushed towards mitigating criminal elements, a lot of the other fundings within societies are left sometimes to the little. So I commend Grand Cayman for your environmental trust. And I'm saddened to say that Trinidad is not on the same page with its environmental trust, because we're dealing with a criminal issue, a gang-related issue. So I just want to put it on a table and ask the question, is music something that is being considered?
Well, if I may respond, I know that that's one of the subject of debate in Jamaica. A number of those who are into entertainment will say that they are just telling you what is happening. So they are not creating the violence, they are telling you the story. There are others of us who say, well, while that may be so, but we also believe that that music has an impact on people's psyche, people's behavior, etc. So that's an ongoing conversation. I believe that some of our entertainers have become more sensitive to the impact that their music is having. And so in some places we are seeing some change, but that's one of the tug-of-war issues, because some of them will say, well, we're just singing what's going on, and would also argue that, but what about those other musical forms that may be just as violent, but it may not use the language that we use? So that debate is going on, but I think that there's sufficient belief that while it may be a part of the reality, it has a negative impact. One of the concerns, for instance, for us is what children are exposed to in public transportation, the diet that they are fed on as they travel to school and back, and how some students gravitate towards those vehicles where that kind of music is there. So it's a concern. It is really a concern.
Jaffet in Lowell, United Church of Canada. Thank you to all the presenters, and when you listen to these big, wonderful ideas and concepts and theories, I'm a practical theologian. I quickly begin to think, how do we bring it down to influence people in the pews in our communities where we live? On the issue of crime, I don't know how much you know about the story of Mozambique and the work that the Christian Council of Mozambique did after the Civil War. There were a lot of guns and a lot of gun violence. And it takes only a spark to get the fire going. Through the work of the Christian Council of Mozambique, the program Turning Swords into Plows, the church was very heavily involved in collecting the guns. Fast forward, that was in the 80s and 90s and part of early 2000. I was in Mozambique about 3 months ago. there's very less gun violence in that country. And the church turned some of those guns into plows, into bicycles, into building materials, and they did a lot of other things. So I'm just sharing that story in terms of the church not being overwhelmed, because this is too large. It took a spark, and they contributed something in that context. My second comment is on the historical injustices in regard to slavery. Many of our church organizations, as earlier alluded, are finding ourselves having been complicit historically. And one school of thought is saying, well, in that case, let us just close the institution, because we were complicit, we were involved. Some churches have done a bit of reparation, given up some land, sold some church buildings. Just how do we harmonize this piece of dealing with the historical injustices vis-a-vis around slavery and the question of reparation? Thank you.
Those are great questions. The issue of reparations, I don't think many persons have taken the time to look at what the broader issue, what the broader conversation is all about. But I want to encourage us to go to I think the CARICOM website, there's something on it that gives us the research that has been done. It's pretty great research by Verity Shepherd. She's a person, Professor Shepherd, who now leads that movement. She's even at the UN, and of course Professor current Vice Chancellor, who have been leading that. So the reparations movement is making a very broad point, which is if you understand the gravity of slavery and the extent of it, and the way it impacted the development of societies, the development of certain important societies, then you'd understand, you'd probably agree with people like the great Guyanese historian, Walter Rodney, who spoke about what happened, for example, how Europe under Africa, that kind of an argument, or even of people like Wallenstein. So the research is very impressive, all right? So I'm going somewhere. Where I'm going is that we have to understand the breadth of the ask coming from what happened, all right? So it's okay for, I've seen, for example, where a few universities in the UK have given something as a start, so say UWI, but that is not the big issue. Is that they're asking for this country to say I'm sorry, and to say our underdevelopment in many instances is linked to what happened. We want to restore that. We want to get going again. So it's a big ask, and the conversation is yet to be started fully. All right. The church, though, I think, can do quite a few things in terms of what you're asking. I think the church stands a very good chance of leading that conversation once it is able to deal with the issue internally, and to then pride itself to say, we can, we're dealing with that issue ourselves. Here's what it will look like, all right? The church has historically, in some instances, been complicit. Not all instances. The instances where they were weird against and something like that. All right, but that's a conversation, I think, that has to continue. I think they can do small things. I think the church also has to, if make a voice in this argument too, all right, in a bigger argument and so on. All right, thanks.
Maybe just two comments. One, I know that in the region, the church has been involved in the conversation about reparation, very involved. And we have already seen some expressions from some of our churches in terms of repairing the relationship. The other one about the guns, I'm not too sure about the other territories in the region, but I know in the Jamaican setting, for instance, We have had gun amnesties with little success, even though some people may say if one illegal gun comes off the road, then it is a success. And I remember we entered a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Security and the police in Jamaica for clergy to be able to receive weapons and hand them in, or people who were wanted by the system. I was a part of that. I can't recall any gun being turned in through that process. There's a concern that sometimes when the amnesties happen, and especially if you pay people, they bring you these old guns that have been around for the longest while, and they use the money to buy new ones. So it's one of those things that we continue to wrestle with. But we've had one or two situations where clergy or others have accompanied people, or where a gun may be left at a particular place, but it is not something that has been responded to in any kind of significant way based on the efforts that have been made already.
You guys want to add? All right, I'd like to add to the discussion on the slavery, and I'll use my own story. When I attended Pittsburgh Theological Seminary was when I got to understand the atrocity of slavery. Back home in Ghana, slavery was sanitized. It was presented as if our folks who came here were living on and working on gold. In our books back home in Ghana, you don't hear much about the atrocities of slavery. It was during one church history time, and the issue about slavery came, and we were reading about it, and I was stunned, and I walked out of the classroom crying because I had no idea about all the dehumanizing and oppressive deeds that were done to our fellow people who were shipped and brought here to the West to do all this plantation work. And after that, I became an assistant student president, and we started making some changes. I remember the World Mission Initiative on campus had a picture posted at one of the places, and it was it's a picture of pain and tiredness and sweat of a black man carrying a load of weight on his head. You know how we carry things, and so I was wondering, how would my son, who had not gone to Africa yet, see this picture and have a good image of our folks back home in Ghana? So I made an appeal, and that picture was taken down. Back then, I was one of the few people who were black on campus. Today, the president of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary is a black person. All I'm saying is we have to educate ourselves, because reparation alone will not bring healing. If we get the reparation and we do not educate ourselves, slavery mutates and it will continue in another form. And for how many times would we have reparations? And the education should start from we, the parents, to get our children to see the wickedness of slavery, so they can vow that never again will they allow slavery to happen to them.
Could I just say, I won't comment on that, I have disagreement, but a lovely study in Cayman, that came out in Cayman on crime and deviance, by Yolande Ford, predisposing factors toward criminality in the Cayman Islands. It's really a good study, and it looks at the extent to which the family break. This study, Yolande Ford, a criminologist, was brought here by the government to investigate the person at Northward. How did they get there? what are the circumstances that led them there. It spoke about the family issues, male absence, was also came out. I haven't heard you speak about the need for values and attitudes, a very important thing we need to get back to stem the crime situation. But I hear you, Reverend. Good points there. But I'll leave it there. Go ahead, sir. Thanks.
Do you want to follow up on that? I have a different question. I have a very different question. Did you want to follow up on any of this?
No, mine is a different question.
So I have a question for Gina, just to change of pace a bit here. All important issues. So yesterday, a few of us got a chance to go out with the Department of the Environment. We saw the mangroves and heard about the corals, and so I think a lot of gratitude for the protection that the Cayman Islands are doing around some of that environmental work. But just following up on a few things that have been said, I know Japheth was talking about a concrete example of what happened in Mozambique around guns. So I want to talk a little bit about concrete examples of what happens around the environment. You said that you had read the Accra Declaration, and good for you, congratulations. Then you asked the question, which I think kind of sat with us, so what are you doing about it? Which is part of our discussion. What are we doing about it? And I wonder how many people outside the church know that this exists, that the church, at least a family within the church, has made this declaration 20 years ago. Even within the church, many of us don't know about it. So how many people outside the church would know about this? And so the question I want to just kind of ask you is, from the perspective of someone who maybe has a understanding from beyond the church, what is said about the church, if anything, around the work of the church around the environmental issue that is an existential question for us? You cited the numbers around the warming that will happen. What are they saying about us from outside of the bubble?
Thank you for your question. I think, well, first of all, I just want to say that thank you for your very complimentary statements about Cayman and the protection of the environment. From where I stand, we have an awful lot left to do. We continue to make very, very poor decisions in relation to the allocation of our environmental resources. And, you know, I think we're as worried here as anywhere about the effects of humanity on our natural systems. We don't have it all right, but we're trying. And I guess the message that I was trying to impart in the brief talk that I gave was that, for me, the church has pretty much been silent on this issue. I don't hear a lot of discussion out there in the community about the church's position on any environmental issue. We regularly try to consult with the church because we see the church as a very important stakeholder in a lot of this discussion. And quite often, you know, it's not that the church is unwilling to engage, but it does so in a very quiet, sort of not front-facing way. And I think that there is a space for the church and faith-based organizations to help people reframe many of the discussions that we're having, whether it's environment or slavery or crime. You know, these are difficult conversations, and clearly some of those issues are backward-looking in terms of issues like slavery, looking at what happened in the past and how it's affecting us now. For the crime and the environmental issues, I think that's more of a forward-looking issue that we're trying to get people to understand if we don't take action now, things will get much worse, and it's not boding very well for us collectively, either on the crime front or the environmental craziness front. So I feel that there is definitely scope for the church to be much more engaged in the environmental discussion and to take some responsibility for helping people to, like I said, understand, well, to understand that there is hope, but giving them a frame in which that hope means taking personal responsibility, holding their governments accountable for not doing the proper thing, and then from a position of love and understanding, rather than conflict and confrontation, have a discussion that is really quite difficult. I mean, it involved, the climate change discussion is hugely politicized, and it's probably why we're not making any progress globally. So the conversation has got to change, and the way that we talk about it has got to change. And I think, for me, the way that happens is by sort of dialing back on those things that separate us and not get so accusatory about, well, you know, you need to do this and you need to do that, but to try to make the link for people between what they care about and what will get some results moving forward from an environmental perspective, whether that is about, you know, talking to their elected officials or taking some kind of personal responsibility for action. I don't know if I've answered your question. I think there's a lot of scope for the church to be more involved in the environmental issue.
Thank you all for the presentations. And I actually want to go back to the question about criminality. And I really appreciated the broadness of the conversation in terms of just so many ways that criminalization, guns, the gang violence, all of that. But I actually have maybe a two-part question in that regard. One is about families, like how is this affecting families, and particularly violence against women, when we talk about this kind of criminal element and what's going on in the home. And the second is around LGBTQIA issues and the ongoing homophobia that tends to be particularly in the Jamaican context. And if you could just reflect a little bit on the church, the presence of the church in regard to those two issues. Thank you.
In terms of the domestic violence situation, in fact, the church has its own contribution to that problem, but I would say that at least some churches have started the conversation around the issues of what happens in families. During the COVID period, for instance, and I know it's not unique to our location because I've heard of it happening elsewhere in the world, we discovered that school was not just about education, but actually that school was a safe place for a number of our children. And so when they had to stay home, the levels of abuse that was reported was significant. But I believe that more churches are beginning to talk about the issue within local congregations. Some churches are engaged in programs of sensitization, etc. But I think we have still a long way to go. I think we have a longer way to go in terms of the LGBT issue. Again, I think we have come a way on the journey. In fact, at least people talk about it now. There's strong views in the region, strong views in Jamaica in relation to this. But the conversations and the openness now that we see where persons are indicating who they are, their LGBT belonging to the community and so forth, we're seeing more of that happening. I mean, during my years, and for those who may not know, before I became moderator of the United Church, I served as General Secretary for the Jamaica Council of Churches for 13 years. And so that facilitated quite a bit of engagement and interactions with persons from the LGBT community. And whether we're dealing with some of their issues, or you're dealing with HIV and AIDS and all of those kinds of issues. But many of our people are still not at that place to embrace. And for us, it is a journey. It's a journey. Some people may never get there. Some people are becoming more understanding, or at least more open to understand, or trying to understand. But that is still a long way for us. And I can say as well that it is not only in the church space, in the political space as well. And, you know, our politicians also are very sensitive because, you know, you need to be able to win elections. So you have to be sensitive to where people are at. But I remember in those days when I was at JCC, the concern was expressed to church leaders of the pressure that the government was facing by other external bodies and conditionalities as well in terms of how benefits or aid may come if you are not open to consider. And so it's a difficult space, but I think that the conversation has started. More people are talking about it, and it will be also interesting to hear the young people. I think they're far more open to engage the subject than some of the seniors. And I think it takes, I remember I used an expression which sounded a little funny, but we have to learn how to move fast slowly. Yeah? Because people are at different stages of this. And it's patient conversation. And I think more of, as people meet real people and have real conversations, then I think persons will better understand and appreciate. But it is still a challenge for us. Again, I think it's important because I think there's a view, and the language used. Jamaica has been homophobic. But based on what I see, people really don't business with you. That's the attitude. You do your thing, people become offended if it is demonstrated or expressed in the public space. People become offended. But nobody is going to ask what's happening in your house, what's happening behind your doors. And even though it is on the book still, I do not know if police going to arrest people because of this. People just don't business. The difficulty I think many people have is in the public space. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, I believe that we have spent a good time together. And one of the things that the last speaker's point maybe leaves us with for the whole conversation is that the work of justice is ongoing work, is patient work, is work that we engage together. And so I invite you to express appreciation to the presenters. And to thank you all. Ms. Angela?
Okay, that was a pretty heady conversation with leaving a whole lot of stuff for us to reflect on. And importantly, the real question was, where's the church in all this? We now move into our closing time for today, and want to invite Reverend Dr. Zach King, General Secretary, Christian Reformed Church in North America,